Well, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks, folks, who were able to be here in person. We also have quite a few people online. For those of you who are joining us online, looks like everybody's on mute now. If you just keep yourself on mute until we get to the Q&A portion, that would be much appreciated. So I'll go ahead and provide a bit of an intro for today for our guest speakers. So thank you all for joining us for another installment in the spring segment of the Department of Anthropology's Pro Seminar Series here at UNLV. And today we are lucky to be joined by Dr. Tremblay, who is coming to us from SUNY Delhi, where she is an assistant professor in the School of Nursing, Arts, and Sciences. She holds an MA in English from the University at Albany and a PhD in anthropology from Ohio State University. I'll take it to the New York people. Did I say Delhi as opposed to Delhi? Okay.
Yes.
Down a Wikipedia rabbit hole this morning.
Part in New York.
Okay. All right. Additionally, as a biological anthropologist specializing in the subfields of bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology, Dr. Tremblay's research focuses on the bioarchaeology of historic era populations, structural violence, biological consequences of social and socioeconomic inequality, trauma, and identity. Along with Sarah Reddy, she is the co-editor of the Bioarchaeology of Structural Violence, a theoretical framework from industrial era inequality, published in 2020, and her most recent edited volume, A Companion of Care, expanding the bioarchaeology of care to population level analyses, appeared on the University Press of Florida in 2022. And I should also note that the co-editor and co-author of the lead introductory essay is our own Dr. Alicia Schrenk. Since joining the faculty at SUNY Delhi, Dr. Tremblay has earned numerous individual and professional development grants. Additionally, she is the recipient of the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Scholarship and Creative Activities. The talk today is titled Structural Violence in Industrial Era United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tremblay.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Barron, for that lovely, wonderful introduction. Hi, everybody. I didn't know that when I put this together that there would be such a lovely introduction. So I actually have a little slide that kind of does that with some really nice pictures. So I'm a biological anthropologist, as Dr. Barron noted, with expertise in bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology. And my work, my research primarily focuses on structural violence in institutionalized and impoverished populations. And I did my undergrad and my master's at the University of Albany. I double majored in undergrad in English and anthropology, then did my master's in anthropology. And as was noted, I did my doctoral studies at Ohio State. Right. So one thing as an anthropologist, I get asked quite often is why anthropology? Right? And why biological anthropology? And it's a little cliche, but I've always, like, from the time I was a little kid, I was always like really, really fascinated by mummies, particularly Egyptian mummies, by the burial practices and the culture of burial practices and funerary rites. That's something that was always really interesting to me. And so in college, when I started majoring in anthropology, I actually started out as a cultural anthropologist because I thought that was the route to study these things. And I really couldn't find my footing in a way that felt right to me. And then a couple of years in, I took an osteology class and a forensic anthropology class with Sharon DeWitt. And it all clicked. Right? It all clicked. I fell in love with the idea of being able to analyze the human skeleton. And I kind of drew on this idea that I learned in my literary studies in undergrad and master's of the body as text, right? Because our bones do tell our stories. And in addition to that, because I always felt so strongly about inequality and how unfairly a lot of folks were treated, I found that through bioarchaeology, I could actually give those people a voice. Because when we hear narratives about the historic era, about the past, a lot of those narratives come from voices that are very privileged with wealth and power. And I've always been more interested in the lives and the stories of everyday people like you and I. So I found that through bioarchaeology, what I could do is I could actually be a voice and share the stories and the lived experiences of folks who were marginalized and who were just everyday people like all of us. Right. So my research focused, as I mentioned, has a two-pronged focus, which is the biological impact of structural violence, as well as healthcare provisioning. Right. And while I'm sure a lot of you are probably already familiar with what structural violence is, um, it's something that is not always seen. It's not always visible. And in fact, this term, this concept was first proposed by Johann Galtung. And I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I'm not entirely sure that I am. So I hope I am. Galtung first introduced this term in 1969, right? And cultural and medical anthropologists have, over the past 20, 30 years kind of described the link between social and socioeconomic inequality and differential health outcomes as structural violence. And the difference between that and direct violence or physical violence is that direct violence or physical violence is visible. You can see it. You can see it in the forms of bruises, cuts, broken bones, disfigured bodies. Structural violence in itself is not necessarily visible. But I would define it as our social institutions that perpetuate and normalize inflicting preventable harm on specific segments of society by not meeting their needs. And this tends to affect those who are already vulnerable or marginalized in some way. And two of the key terms in that definition would be that it's normalized and that it's preventable. And the cultural violence is the part that actually normalizes it, because it's the perception of social groups regarding disadvantage. And that's because structural violence is seen as a kind of static, stable, and natural part of society, right? So Galtung had also argued that that's why structural violence may not be intentional on the part of the actors who make those decisions about resource distribution. That's simply because they see it as just a natural part of society. So we don't see it going on, but what we can see are the results of it on the body, right? And I am particularly interested in institutions of care. So during the era of industrialization, from like the mid 18th century through the mid 19th century through the early 20th century, we see a lot of industrialization, and that industrialization and the population density increases that occurred along with the growth of industrialized cities kind of served as an impetus, along with changes in how people were thinking about others. It served as an impetus for the creation of institutions of care. And I would define an institution of care as any governmental or privately funded facility that provides a very carefully and culturally constructed environment, as well as indoor relief for those who cannot provide for their own basic needs and protections, right? So these state institutions served as cultural buffers to protect those who were vulnerable from the risks they may have faced in prisons or on the streets. Right. So this upsurge in the creation of these institutions that were designed to care for and reform those who were considered socially undesirable was also accompanied by this emphasis on classification of individuals and the ways in which an individual's merit was directly tied to his or her production. Right. What were they giving to society? How productive were they as working members of society? Right. So we see institutions of care cropping up, and examples of those are asylums, sanatoriums, poorhouses, and orphanages, right? And two of the primary institutions I've done research in are poorhouses and mental health asylums. Now, they were typically called insane asylums at the time, but I don't feel that using that adjective is really appropriate. So we're going to go with mental health asylums, right? So poorhouses and asylums at the time were kind of created for dual purposes, right? They provided relief, right, which is caring for the poor who were in need due to illness, disability, or advanced age. And they were also designed to correct a moral compass, meaning it was to discourage people from using almshouses and poorhouses, right? And that's because they were created as a refuge for the poor, but also a deterrent to the able-bodied, right? As they were indicated at that time, right? Mental health asylums were created at this time also because what we saw were shifts in beliefs about mental illness. Because prior to this time, mental illness, like poverty, was viewed as a moral failing, but physicians at this time started to realize and understand that mental illness was an illness, right? And it was something that needed treatment. It wasn't a morality issue. It was literally an issue that needed to be treated, right? So this particular project focuses on structural violence in the industrial area in the northeastern and the midwestern United States, right? And so the focus of this project was to determine whether and to what extent different segments of institutionalized and impoverished populations in the late 19th and early 20th century United States were at risk for various types of physiological stress. And I did this by looking at two populations and looking at nonspecific indicators of stress, dental disease, and trauma. And those two sites that I used for this study were the Oneida State Custodial Asylum, which is in upstate New York, and the Milwaukee County Institution Grounds, which is located near Milwaukee, Wisconsin. For this particular project, I only analyzed skeletal remains in which the individuals were 70% or more complete with good to excellent preservation. The only exception to that were the identified asylum individuals in Milwaukee because there were so very few of them. Okay, so this is the Oneida State Custodial Asylum, which is located in Rome, New York. And you can see on the right, or at least my right, I assume it's on your right as well. That's a picture of the Oneida State Asylum right there. And on the left, you can see the map. The red star indicates the location of this particular asylum. And this was in a rural area that was outside of the city limits of Rome. So it was located in a rural area. This asylum was in operation from the 1860s until the 1890s and a little bit beyond that. Prior to being used as a mental health asylum, the United States Custodial Asylum functioned as an almshouse up until about the 1850s. But at that time, as an almshouse, it was only providing outdoor relief, which means you came and got help, but you didn't stay there. Indoor relief means that they were housing you, right? So what's interesting about this is that the majority of the folks who lived in this institution, who were referred to as inmates, and that's the term that they used, they didn't use patients, they were considered inmates because they were institutionalized. A lot of these folks came from middle and upper class backgrounds, right? And we have the documentation, the historic documentation of that. And that's because this was, for the time, considered a state-of-the-art institution that held up to 300 inmates, right? And as a state-of-the-art institution, like that was the claim, and that's how it's written about. The focus on the physicians who would come in and check on the patients was to treat and to cure these folks of the illnesses that they had through labor therapy, because the belief at the time was that you could cure mental illness by putting folks into an environment that had like a normal, like family style structure, and where they were doing hard physical labor, because they thought that hard physical work would actually help cure whatever mental illnesses they were suffering from. But that labor therapy varied based on an individual's gender. So the women were actually tasked with doing all of the indoor work. So they had to do all of the making and mending of clothes, all of the food prep and cooking, and all of the cleaning and maintenance of the interior of the institution. Men, on the other hand, did the outdoor work. So they were tending animals, doing all the agricultural work, planting, harvesting crops, tending crops, weeding, taking care of the grounds, tending all the animals, working at the slaughterhouse to process animals for consumption, all that kinds of things. And in addition to treatment, if inmates didn't do what they were supposed to do, or they weren't following directions, or they acted in a way that was deemed inappropriate by the staff, their punishments also sometimes involved physical labor. For example, there was this one thing called the polisher that was used as a form of punishment for inmates who didn't do what they were supposed to, or who were not following directions, or being inappropriate, as they determined inappropriate. And the polisher was this 100-pound cement block that was covered in cloth and attached to a broom. And they would have to push this broom up and down the hallway all day, every day, for days. Right. So this was a long-term facility. So folks who were in this facility typically came in early adulthood and spent the rest of their lives there. The other population I examined was from Milwaukee County, and that the Milwaukee County Institutional Grounds, which was also called the Milwaukee Poor Farm Cemetery. And that cemetery was in use from about the early 1880s into the 1920s. So there's some time overlap between these two burial grounds, and it's located in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. My apology to any folks from Wisconsin if I'm mispronouncing Wauwatosa. Oops, sorry. My computer is very, very sensitive. So essentially, the cemetery, the Milwaukee Poor Farm Cemetery, which is associated with the county institution grounds, was where all of the impoverished people in the area were buried, unclaimed bodies from the medical examiner's office, as well as those from institutions. There was an almshouse, which you can see, that photo in the center is a picture of the almshouse that was located in Wauwatosa. So we had an almshouse, there was a mental health asylum, a tuberculosis sanatorium, and as well as orphanages. And you can see the photo all the way to the right is a picture of an orphanage. Right. So as part of a salvage archaeology project, there were 1,649 individuals recovered between 1991 and 1992. And just under 1,000 of those were adults. The remaining 600 and some were subadults. And I, of course, because of my criteria, I was able to analyze about, and time constraints, I was able to analyze about 115. Right. And from Oneida, those folks were recovered also as part of a salvage archaeology project in 1998, and 102 individuals were recovered from that, but only 46 met the criteria. So the sample size is a little small, but it's bigger. It can get bigger. There was actually a second excavation for the Milwaukee County Institution grounds, right? But if we look at the demography of the sample, right, we have a total of 113 folks who are probably male, 34 who are probably female, 14 folks were classed as indeterminate. We could not assess sex for those folks. And you can see the majority of them were young to middle-aged adults at the time of death, right? Of course, there's a significant amount that we could not, I could not estimate age on. So I assessed sex for these individuals by scoring the morphological features of the skull and the pelvis, using Spikestra and Ubelacker's standards as it's laid out in there, along with using humeral and femoral head diameters as an additional line of evidence for sex assessment. For age estimation, I use Suchi Brooks's method for scoring the pubic symphysis and Lovejoy's method for the auricular surface. If I were doing this now, I would use transition analysis, but at the time I was not familiar with that particular method. Right. So I looked at a variety of indicators, as I mentioned earlier, non-specific indicators of stress, dental disease, and trauma. So I looked at the various factors that could contribute to potential risk for an individual experiencing some of these types of physiological stress. So I looked at site, so location, status, whether they were impoverished or poor, or whether they were institutionalized, and whether they were male or female. So when I looked at sex as a factor, those who were indeterminate were excluded from that analysis. Right. So I looked at two non-specific indicators of stress. One of those was linear enamel hypoplasias, which can tell us about an individual who experienced some type of physiological stress during their period of growth and development, whether it was malnutrition, disease. There are a lot of different things that can cause linear enamel hypoplasias. And those manifest as like a groove in the enamel of the tooth, right? A horizontal groove, and they're usually palpable. So if you, this is the non-scientific fingernail test, right? You can run your fingernail over the tooth to see if you can actually feel it there, but usually use oblique lighting as well. So I recorded only antimeric linear enamel hypoplasias because of its antimeric, and it's on both sides, right? So both of your canines, your upper canines, are developing at the same time. That's an indication that this was the result of systemic stress and not like trauma or something else, right? So for this, I was looking for systemic stress. And I also looked at periosteal reactions, right? And the majority of the variables, when I analyze them, I use chi-square analysis to see if any of those variables, such as site, status, or sex, was related to the presence of that particular indicator. Okay, so when I looked at whether location was a risk for LEH, it was, right? So the folks in Milwaukee were at higher risk for experiencing childhood stress than folks in Oneida, right? Or in Rome, New York, right? This is also supported that status was also a risk factor. So those who were impoverished were significantly more likely to demonstrate LEH, indicating they had stress during childhood, than those who were institutionalized, right? And that's likely because most of the folks who were institutionalized did not come from impoverished backgrounds. They came from middle class and upper class backgrounds. So they likely during childhood had better resources provided to them, right? Sex was not a factor, right? So sex was not a factor in a risk factor for whether you would have stress during your period of growth and development. Right? Then we have periosteal reactions. My apologies if you can hear that. I'm sorry, this heater in my office, because I'm in New York, it's a little chilly here, is making all kinds of noise. So I hope y'all can hear it. So periosteal reactions, which is just simply changes in appearance and morphology of the periosteum on the bone, right? Sometimes in the cortices of the bone. Has multiple etiologies, which means there are a lot of different things that can actually cause a periosteal reaction, right? Malnutrition, trauma, infectious and metabolic diseases can all cause various types of periosteal reactions, right? So this can be used for differential diagnosis to kind of figure out what specific diseases an individual may have experienced. But for the purpose of this study, I was looking just for presence, and if they had it, looking for general risk rather than specific diseases. right? So whether location was a factor, it was not, right? The statistical analysis tell us that where you lived was not really a factor. However, if you were institutionalized, that was a factor, right? So what we see is that folks who were institutionalized had a significantly higher risk of experiencing the variety of things that could cause a periosteal reaction in comparison to their counterparts that were impoverished, right? And sex also, which was a little surprising because I wasn't expecting that, but if you were female, you were slightly more likely to experience the variety of things that cause periosteal reactions than if you were male. Right. So one of the other stress markers I looked at was dental disease. So I looked at both carious lesions and antemortem tooth loss as well. Okay. So for antemortem tooth loss, right, we see that happening. And that just means, for those of you who are not as familiar with the skeleton, that just means your teeth are gone or missing, before you pass away. Right now, typically this is primarily due to some form of dental disease like dental caries or gum disease, but there are other causes such as trauma or extraction that can result in antemortem tooth loss. Right. So when we look at what factors may have been an influence in risk for antemortem tooth loss, sight was not a risk. Neither was status, right? So there was no real risk, depending on whether you were institutionalized or poor, in terms of, your risk for actually losing your teeth. And sex also was not a factor, right? And so I also looked at carious lesions, right? And so when we're looking at carious lesions, dental caries is the disease process that causes cavities, right? It can cause anything from a tiny little pinhole cavity in your tooth to complete destruction and loss of a tooth, right? So typically when you're looking at caries, you might use caries rate, which is the percentage of observable teeth with the carious lesions. However, because of the really high amount of antemortem tooth loss, and because we don't necessarily know the causes of all of that antemortem tooth loss, using the caries rate was really not a viable way to assess that. So instead, what I did is I used the disease and missing tooth index. And what that does is that actually combines carious teeth that are present with antemortem tooth loss to see, in relation to how many observable sockets there are, right? So how many teeth could there have been, right? So postmortem loss was excluded from this. And to do this analysis, I used the Mann-Whitney U test because I needed a parametric test because the distribution was not normal, so I could compare these two groups. Sex was not a significant factor, but sight and status was, right? So being in Milwaukee or being poor actually put you at a higher rate of experiencing diseased or missing teeth. And what was really interesting about that was that the folks in Milwaukee actually exhibited evidence of dental care on their teeth. I saw fillings, right? Gold was pretty common at that particular time and place. So I saw gold fillings, gold crowns, as well as evidence of denture wear, which kind of makes the alveolar bone look kind of tinted and kind of peaked instead of being low and rounded. So there was evidence of folks in Milwaukee did receive dental care, and the folks in Oneida did not, unless their dental care was simply extraction, right? So the folks in Oneida, which was a state-of-the-art institution at the time, supposedly, were not receiving the same level of dental care as their poorer counterparts in Milwaukee were. And one of the last stress indicators I looked at was trauma. Right. So I looked at both antemortem fractures. I did not look at perimortem fractures because honestly, there really wasn't a lot of perimortem trauma, which is a good thing, right? But I looked at antemortem fractures as well as Schmorl's nodes, right? So what I found in terms of risk for trauma and risk for antemortem fractures is that location did actually was a factor, right? So the folks who were in Milwaukee and the folks who were recovered from that Milwaukee County Institution Brown Cemetery, the Poor Farm Cemetery, were much more likely to have had antemortem fractures than their counterparts in Oneida. And I was actually expecting the opposite because folks who are institutionalized for mental health reasons tend to be more vulnerable to abuse. But it was likely the types of labor that the folks in Milwaukee were engaging in that put them at higher risk for trauma, right? And this is further supported when we look at those who were, oh, sorry, lost myself for a second there. I had expected, again, those who were institutionalized to have to be at higher risk, and that was not the case. Right? Those were poorer. And then sex was not a risk factor at all, right? In whether or not an individual would experience antemortem trauma. Right? Now, I also looked at Schmorl's nodes, and I was interested in this because this is a very specific type of trauma that can be caused by an acute, severe traumatic injury, but we also see it. It's also very common and is because it's a burst fracture that results from disc herniation. So it's really common or much more commonly seen in folks who are doing repeated long-term heavy labor that puts a lot of strain on the back. And given the amount of labor therapy that folks at Oneida were engaging in, as well as the industrial factory work we saw folks in Milwaukee engaging in, I thought this would be a really interesting type of trauma that could tell us about their experiences. Right. So site was a risk factor, right? The folks who were in Milwaukee showed a statistically significantly higher risk for Schmorl's nodes compared to their Oneida counterparts, right? And that's further supported by the status analysis, which also shows that folks who were impoverished were at a significantly higher risk for experiencing this very specific type of traumatic lesion. Sex was not a factor, right? Did not provide any risk factors whatsoever. Right? And I went a little faster than I expected. But that leaves more time for questions, right? So the conclusions, what I learned from this is that when we're looking at various factors that affect risk for experiencing physiological stress as a result of structural violence, site was a risk factor for a number of these, right? The folks in Milwaukee were at higher risk for childhood stress, which we can see manifested as linear enamel hypoplasias. They were at higher risk for dental disease, skeletal trauma, and Schmorl's nodes. Simply being in Oneida didn't really have many significant risks. Status, being impoverished put folks at higher risk for childhood stress, that we can see through those linear enamel hypoplasias, dental disease, and Schmorl's nodes. And periosteal reactions were a risk for those who were institutionalized. In terms of sex, the only risk based on your sex was if you were female, you were at a slightly higher risk to experience the variety of things that could create periosteal reactions. Right? So the risk for experiencing certain kinds of physiological stress as a result of belonging to a particular group are not the result of belonging to that group, but are the result of the normalized pervasive structures of oppression and marginalization that are created and maintained by those who control the resources to prevent or ameliorate those stressors, right? So it's not the state of actually being mentally ill or impoverished that in and of itself puts someone at higher risk for experiencing those various kinds of physiological stress. It's that being impoverished or being mentally ill was deemed socially desirable, and therefore those people were marginalized, kind of pushed to the edges of society, and that increased their risk for experiencing stress. Now, of course, there are a few limitations to this. Number one, sample access. There are not a lot of samples available of institutionalized populations because, rightly so, most of those folks have been reinterred rather than curated. And there also are no samples of non-institutionalized middle and upper class individuals to do any kind of comparison with. Right. And of course, the sample size is a little small, which is always a little bit of a limitation. So acknowledgements, the alumni grants for graduate research and the Coca-Cola critical difference for women. And I want to acknowledge the folks who curate those collections and provided me time and access in space to collect the data for this particular project. Short list of references. And that's it. I know I'm a few minutes early. I think I talked faster than I planned to, but thank you very, very much. And I am open to questions.
Do a quick round. And Gloria, having watched a lot of these videos, I know that for whatever reason, clapping doesn't always come through. So just know there was actual clapping in the room.
Okay. Thank you.
As well. So yeah, we can use the time that we have for any questions, either from folks that are in the room or those of you that are in the Zoom room. If you want to just go ahead and type yours into the chat, I can also field them as well. So Lisa.
Hi, Dr. Tremblay. Thank you for sharing your work with us. I have a question in reference to the Oneida institution. Can you speak a little bit more about, I mean, you said this is middle and upper classes, presumably they have some kind of a support network. What are the typical kind of contexts in which somebody would find themselves institutionalized? Like, what are the kinds of things that were considered mental health issues during this time? And then the second question would be, did they also pay for this labor therapy? Because it's quite a racket. I like it.
No, they did not. They did not get paid. They did not. I'm just writing down. I don't want to forget. The why is really interesting. And, it could be from things that, maybe folks who just didn't act like everyone else in society. So, I mean, it could be anything from depression, it could be things like perhaps schizophrenia or just someone who kind of doesn't fit in. But the literature, like there is an intake form, which I don't have with me. But it's really interesting. There's a whole list of a variety of different things you could be institutionalized for. just acting out of sorts, not bathing enough, being difficult. Chronic masturbation was another one of those things. So, not bathing, basically just not following social norms, right? Or if you were too opinionated and you were physically female, that could also result in institutionalization. So there are a whole variety of factors, but it's primarily like if you're not following the social norms of the time and behaving exactly like everyone else and doing the things everyone else is doing, you might have been at risk for being institutionalized. Or if you, alternatively, there were also people in there who were severely physically disabled as well. So if you couldn't care for yourself and maybe your family, even if they were middle or upper class, either could not or did not want to care for you. There was one man who was, I would classify it as internally decapitated because the dens on his C2 kind of broke off and completely healed. So he survived that, but he had very severe injuries to his neck, to his ribs, and to his elbow. I believe it was his left elbow. So also being physically disabled was also one of the reasons why you could end up in an institution like Oneida.
Okay, thank you.
Did I answer your question? I'm sorry. Is there any part of that I might have missed?
You did. I knew that our ideas about mental health have changed, and that also during this time, you could be committed for very easily. I imagine it's mostly your family members that are doing it. Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a great question.
Well, I have a question about I guess like the dentistry side of it, because you mentioned in it that like kind of surprisingly in the Milwaukee example, that seems to be the case where there was more care for people's teeth, which seems a little counterintuitive if we know that the Oneida example is more upper or middle class folks. So do you have any sort of like working hypotheses to account for that difference?
Well, I mean, the Milwaukee was kind of at the tail end, right? So the Oneida State Custodial Asylum, from what we know, the burial stopped in the 1890s. So there was about a 10-year, a decade overlap. But even though Oneida was considered state of the art, the conditions, right? That was the kind of historical narrative and the narrative of the folks who were running it. But when you start reading the reports, when they went in to do inspections, there was a whole lot of, let's just say the conditions were incredibly unsanitary. Like beds hadn't been cleaned and were used for years. There was urine and feces all over. There was one mention, which I cannot get out of my head, and I apologize to putting this into y'all's heads, that the wooden toilet seats were kind of soaked in with 20 years worth of urine. So even though it was considered state of the art, I don't know that they were necessarily receiving any dental care because the conditions in there were far from optimal, even though it was considered state of the art. And it could be also possibly, and this is just conjecture on my part, that being closer to Milwaukee in a larger industrial area, maybe folks were able to get access to dental schools, or practicing dentists were able to do that kind of work. It's not entirely clear. So I don't know if it's the time difference. I don't know if it's the deplorable conditions, or if it's a little bit more access in Milwaukee, or perhaps a combination of those, or there could be other factors at play that I'm just not aware of. So I hope that answers your question.
No, definitely.
Okay, so this is kind of a, hey, Lori.
Hey.
You see on little projects together before. So I actually just thought of something. Could it be that if they're in some of the more upper classes, they have more access to sugar before they got in? Because this is a period where sugar processing becomes an elite or getting it. Oh, that's a paper we should look at. Anyhow, sorry.
Yeah. No. Because you know what? Now that you say that, so the diet that the folks in Oneida were eating, and I've read through some of the menus, and they're pretty interesting. They were pretty high in karyogenic foods like refined sugars and potatoes. So they were eating the things that all of the folks in the rural areas were eating. So they actually had a better diet that could have actually contained more of those karyogenic foods like those refined sugars while they were in the asylum compared to the folks in Milwaukee who might not have been able to afford those foods. So yes. And yes, let's work on that. Text me later.
Yes.
Yeah.
When we have time.
Yeah. Yeah. After the semester. Yeah.
After the year.
Yeah.
Other folks, before I jump in with another question. I have another one sort of following back to the Milwaukee material, and there might not be an answer for this, but you mentioned that for that data set, it's coming from a variety of institutions, orphanages, sanitariums, and asylums. At least in the case of the, well, I guess for any of them, do you have a sense, maybe just through the historical research, the demographics of the people that would have been coming from those institutions, like in the same, basically kind of getting down to, in the New York example, you have a pretty clear sense of class. Is there any inklings of that for the Milwaukee material?
A little bit, but not a lot. So there wasn't enough literature that I found on some of those institutions. The orphanages were typically kids who were, their parents had passed, or if their parents were in a poorhouse or an almshouse, they may have been taken and put into an orphanage, because they didn't want the children repeating the patterns of their parents and becoming impoverished and depending on the state. Out of that first excavation, there was a second excavation, but I don't have that included in this. I haven't looked at that yet. So about 20%, because of the historical records and some burial tag markers that were found, they were able to identify about 20%. It was like 190 people out of the almost 1,000 adults that were recovered. They were able to identify those people. So we know a little bit about some of those folks, but the overwhelming majority of people who were buried there were those who were poor, those who were unclaimed, people who would drown in the river. They would they would recover their bodies and bury them, and they didn't know who we are, or who they were. So for the overwhelming majority of folks there, we really just don't know as much about them, or I don't at this point. So I wish I knew more. I hope does that answer your question? I hope so.
No, definitely. Other folks, either in here or online, not seeing anything through the chat. Well, with that, we'll go ahead. We can surrender the rest of your afternoon back to you, Dr. Tremblay. Thank you so much for being able to do this. We really appreciate it. We'll do another sort of smattering of applause if we can, either in the room and online.
Oh, thank you. Yes, and thank you so much for inviting me. I wish I could have been there in person, but that just wasn't possible at this point in time. But thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate it as well. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you. Everybody have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.